All right, welcome, and thank you all for joining us this evening for the Collections and Research Department's webinar, The Common Clock, Clockmaking in New England. My name is Brittany Garrett, and I am the Collections and Research Public Programming Specialist here at Old Sturbridge Village. And tonight we will be discussing the history of clockmaking in New England and explore how and why clocks became so prevalent in early 19th century homes. This wonderful presentation will be done by Tom Vaughn, OSV's Lead of Music. Tom has had a long history with clockmaking. He was the former vice president of the Plymouth, Connecticut Historical Society and board member of the Bristol, Connecticut Historical Society, where he oversaw the museum's collections and focused on the community's clockmaking history. He has also worked at the American Clock and Watch Museum in Bristol, Connecticut, where he started volunteering at the age of 12. He also has several publications in the National Association of Watch and Clock Collectors Cog Counters Journal and for the New England Historical Society. In addition, he restores and builds clocks out of his Plymouth, Connecticut workshop and is one of the last people still producing whole wooden movement clocks in the US. Thank you, Tom, for joining us tonight. And before I hand things over to Tom,
Thanks, Brittany.
Sorry about that. Before I hand things over to you, I just have a few more technical things to share. So this program is being recorded and it will be posted on the Old Sturbridge Village YouTube page, which I encourage you all to visit. And there will also be a question and answer session following our presentation tonight. So I invite all our live viewers to submit questions at any point during the presentation in the Q&A feature, which is at the bottom center of your screen. And now it is all yours, Tom. Go for
it. Thank you. All righty. Hello, everybody. So today, this talk that we're going to be doing is going to be on clocks and clockmaking in New England. And the focus is going to be the common clock, which is kind of my specialty. So I focus on the years 1709 to 1840. And the common clock goes well beyond 1840, all the way up to the present day. But we cut off at 1840 because it ties in a little bit more with the village. So this will be a discussion on basically affordable timepieces. And at the end, I'll do a little bit more touching up on the clock that I reproduced for the Bixby house here at the village. So let's see. Alrighty, so colonial clockmaking. In the colonial era, clockmaking was a little bit different, really significantly different than it was in the early 19th century during the village period. So clocks at this time were rare. They're typically an imported luxury item. Clockmakers were divided between two different groups, which were brass clockmakers and wooden clockmakers. That means that the mechanism of brass clocks are made of brass, and the mechanism, obviously, of wooden clocks are made of wood. The first documented clockmaker in America was Abel Potty from Pennsylvania. He was a Quaker who made his first clock supposedly in 1709. That's the earliest documentation that we can find on a actual clockmaker producing and selling something in an account. The first documented wooden clockmaker was Ebenezer Parmalee of Guilford, Connecticut. And that supposedly happened in 1712, but no clocks from his early workshop dating that early exist today. So I have two pictures here of a standard brass clock movement, and they're actually almost to scale in the photos. So you can see that the brass clocks are really well built. They're really well refined. They're really complicated mechanisms, where the wooden clocks, like the one on the right, are usually typically oversized. We call them crude clocks. They're usually hand-sawn. If you look at the gears on the one on the right, you could, especially the biggest gear there, you could see all of the hand cut marks on it. And that was made by Thomas Sad. That's one of my favorite timepieces from the period. So now this talk is going to be focusing on Connecticut-made clocks, and I won't really be touching up too much on Massachusetts clocks, which most people are really interested in. And the reason why is because Massachusetts clocks are typically higher quality luxury items, typically. So they're typically made with old school practices following the older traditions. They're higher quality materials. They're not typical of the average family. So the average lower class, working class, or lower middle class family probably would not have a timepiece like the ones pictured here, which are typical examples of Massachusetts style clocks. All of the clocks that you'll see in these images here are from the museum collection. Most of the clocks during this presentation are from our collection here. Now the families that you typically attribute with Massachusetts clocks are the Willard family, the Bailey family, the Joshua Wilder, his shop, and there's a whole bunch of others, but the Willards are probably the most famous: Simon Willard, Benjamin Aaron, and I think they made clocks for the president, and all sorts of things. But we'll focus more on the Connecticut clock. So the Connecticut school is a term that was coined, I believe, by Gary Sullivan. This is really an awesome term and an awesome phrase, because I think it really helps divide the region, because there really is a regional divide in people who are making clocks. So it starts with Thomas Harland. He was an English immigrant. He actually moved here in 1773. He moved here from London, and he started making clocks and fixing watches. Now, this is an individual who would have been predominantly fixing watches and jewelry. And in his spare time, he could have made a few clocks that he would have sold. Now, he trained Daniel Burnap. Daniel Burnap moved to East Windsor, Connecticut, later Coventry or Andover, Connecticut. And you can see the similarities in the clocks that they go on. This is a quick evolution here of the three early makers that started this school. Now, Daniel Burnap trained Eli Terry, and Eli Terry is probably one of the most famous people out of Connecticut who made timepieces and was a clockmaker. He's really the Connecticut version of the Willards, basically, if you want to put it that way. And Eli Terry is one of my personal favorite clockmakers. I grew up a couple miles away from his house. I actually grew up in the hometown of Plymouth, Connecticut. So I'll go to the next slide here. Now, these clocks are made in an apprenticeship system. And an apprenticeship system is something that's falling out of fashion in the early 19th century, the early 1800s, because of people like Eli Terry. So the first three generations of the Connecticut school learned through apprenticeships. Daniel Burnap apprenticed to Harland, and Terry apprenticed to Burnap. Through this process, young men would typically apprentice under master clockmakers. They would often assist in different types of work. So few clocks were produced this way, maybe up to about a dozen a year, sometimes more, and clocks were extremely expensive. Now, the average clockmaker was primarily someone who was skilled in casting and working with higher quality materials. So Thomas Harland focused more on repairing watches and made scientific instruments like ship's compasses, protractors, measuring tools, surveying tools especially. And Daniel Burnap primarily repaired watches, and he was really a worker of silver and gold. So he made buckles, he made eyewear, he was making clocks as a small portion of the work that was done. Now, I have some pictures on the bottom here of some of the things that I've done and worked on. So there's some watch tools on the left, and the second picture there is actually a crucible where I was melting down some brass, and actually that's silver in that picture, to do some silver work. There's a picture of a gear cutting machine. So you'd have some people working on a forge, you'd have some people cutting out gears. These apprentices would be working with the clockmakers in their shop. And there's a lovely photograph of a Thomas Harland watch that's there. That's actually a watch that was made or repaired by Thomas Harland. It has his name engraved on it. You can see how complicated those early watches were. So Eli Terry is really one of the most prolific industrialists, I think, to come out of the early 19th century. He's one of my real idols. He's one of the people who, if I got a chance to go back in time and meet someone, it would be this guy. Eli Terry learned brass clock making from Daniel Burnap, but he realized it's a really difficult process. You can't really get brass in bulk in the late 1700s. You couldn't just buy it off of a ship in bulk material. It wasn't that easy, and it was too expensive, and it was difficult to do. So you typically see advertisements from Daniel Burnap asking for scrap brass in newspapers. So he'll be putting out things in the Hartford Courant, asking for people to sell their old candlesticks or andirons that might have brass on them, or maybe a shovel or an ash shovel or things like that. And Eli Terry saw that that was really impractical. Recycling materials and melting them down was not a profitable way to make money. So he switched to wooden clocks in 1793. He went to Benjamin Cheney, we believe, or his brother Timothy. And I personally believe Terry worked a little bit with a gentleman named Elijah Cheney, who was Benjamin's son, and he worked there learning how to make wooden clocks. What he actually ended up doing was moving to Plymouth, Connecticut. At that time, it was called Watertown. It changed its name right afterwards, but he moved to a rural area that was an agricultural community where he could better profit from average working class families. So Eli Terry actually only really started making wooden clocks. He made a couple of brass ones, but he switched to wood right off the bat. So he was the first in the United States to receive a timepiece patent in 1797. He introduced mass production techniques in 1806 in what's called the Porter contract. That'll come up again later. He developed the first mass-produced shelf clock in 1815, and his practices permanently ended the apprenticeship system in the clockmaking field. So any apprenticeship systems in clockmaking really stopped because of Eli Terry. Some of them lingered on into the 1810s, but by the 20s, by the 30s, they didn't exist anymore. They were all factories. So the Porter contract, this happened right down the street from my childhood home. Very good close friend of mine, Fran Block, owns the property here, which has a gorgeous waterfall. And there's a huge drop there for water power, but I'll get into that later. So Levi G. and Edward Porter were two peddlers. They were people working out of Waterbury, Connecticut, who peddled goods. That means they would go from door to door, delivering materials and selling them to people. You could buy directly from a peddler cart in front of your home. And they contracted Eli Terry in 1806 to produce 4,000 clocks in 3 years. Now, at that time, the average clockmaker for wooden clocks might only make maybe a few dozen a year. There were a few individuals, the Ashby brothers, the Edwards brothers in Ashby, Massachusetts. They made about 500 clocks in the 1790s. Eli Terry made 200 clocks in 1805 and was really criticized for it. They told him he wouldn't live long enough to finish them, and if he did, he wouldn't live long enough to sell them. But Eli Terry realized living in a rural area, you can market on lower classes, and that's why he made these wooden gear clocks, which were more affordable. So the peddlers were actually not targeting Western Massachusetts. They were targeting down south, the deep south, Alabama, Louisiana, Virginia, low southern states, Georgia especially. So Terry set up machinery in an old grist mill and started production the following year. He finished 3,000 clocks in 1808 and made an additional several thousand by 1809. Now, this is the first time that we can prove that something in the United States was produced using actual true interchangeable parts. So it's really, we consider it in the clock community the first time that something was made on a modern industrial standard. So this criteria was set up by an expert horologist, Thomas Grimshaw from Cheshire, Connecticut. And his criteria was that mass production of a finished good and machinery operated by unskilled laborers. All machinery has to be non-human power. Precision templates, jigs, and gauges had to be used. There could be no hand fitting or hand finish work. There has to be a division of labor, and all steps have to be accomplished in one facility. And this is what is considered really the modern standard for an industrial practice. This is what all modern industries after the Porter contract would follow typically. And Terry's the first person to meet all of these. Now, there's a whole debate on Eli Whitney, who was mass producing firearms at the same time, but Eli Whitney didn't submit his contract for several thousand firearms to the government until the fall of 1809. And Eli Terry beat him with a privately sponsored contract with private peddlers. So there's a picture here of the factory, and there's a picture of a clock mechanism that was made by Eli Terry at the Porter contract. That's actually a clock in my personal collection. It's actually running right now as we speak. It still works today after over 200 years. And these clockmakers are only making the mechanism and the face. So what you see in the photo with some wooden gears behind it is what you'd buy. When you'd buy a clock like this, you'd have to build the case for it yourself. And that's when you get that grandfather clock looking timepiece, or we call them tall case clocks. So when you'd buy one of these clocks, you'd only get the mechanism. You'd probably hang it up on the wall for a few years. We call that a wag on the wall clock. And you'd have to pay a cabinet maker. So not only are you spending money on a mechanism, you have to spend probably the same or more money on a case made by a cabinet maker, which was a really difficult process. It was expensive and it didn't really help the affordability thing that Terry was trying to go for. So in 1815, he designed a new clock, which is actually pictured here. We call it the box clock. We actually have an original one in our collection. That's it pictured there. I believe there are less than 8 of those that are still in circulation today. There's only a small handful that survived, but those are the first clocks ever made that are actually cased and put in a shelf that are mass produced. They're made on a standard system where the average people can afford them. Now there's a couple people like the Willards in Massachusetts who are making quote unquote shelf clocks, but those are expensive things. Those are kind of a novelty. That's something you'd invest a lot of money in. These clocks were cheap. They would cost as low as $15. So Chauncey Jerome, who was a joiner, he's going to come up later because he's a big character in the early history here. He was hired in 1816 to assist in further developing the case design. Now, if you look on the right, you can see what's called the pillar and scroll clock. And that clock is basically the same thing as the box clock. It just has some ornamentation on the top, the bottom, and the sides. Now, Chauncey Jerome was a joiner, so he was someone who was doing woodworking in houses, building mantles and trim and things like that. So he was a perfect person for the job to do the woodworking on the case there. So Terry patented the scroll clock in 1816, and he received more patents for what he called the common clock. He's the one who came up with that term. In 1823, 2 in 1825, 3 patents in 1826, and 1 final patent in 1845. So the number of clocks produced at this time is unknown, but account books with a single peddler in 1822 list over 2,600 clocks in one shop. The shops would sell for a few dollars, the clocks would sell for a few dollars and be resold by peddlers for a little bit more. So I like to tie in Outwork. Now, for visitors who've been to the village, we really like to talk about Outwork, especially in homes like the Bixby family. And we'll talk a little bit more about the Bixbys later, but there were 3 daughters there and the mother who did a type of outwork. That's basically working from home to establish a line of credit or get some sort of income from home, basically. So clock making actually included a lot of outwork. They would actually have young ladies, typically sometimes young gentlemen, paint the faces of the clocks and paint the paintings that are on the doors. So if you go back to the pillar and scroll clock case, you can see there's a gorgeous painting on the door that's on glass. So here are 3 examples that kind of show how they changed over time. So the one on the left is a hand-done painting. Now, a clockmaker would actually drop off glass, blank pieces of glass at these girls' homes, and they would paint them. And basically, they would work on them at their own will. As soon as they got a batch done, they would probably reach out and they'd come back and pick up the pieces that were finished. And they'd probably have a credit lined up at a local store, or they might get paid outright in cash. That happened occasionally. We have some early records for actual cash transactions going on. The painting in the middle is from Goshen, Connecticut, and that's a lovely little painting with a little cat on it. And it's actually not a painting. That's from the 1830s, and that's a new process that made it faster because so many clocks were being made by the village period, they couldn't keep up with all of the handwork. So that's called a decalcomania. It's an image that's printed on rice paper and it's glued to the glass with shellac, and they actually wash the rice paper off and the ink sticks to the painting and then to the glass, and then they can paint over it and make it colorful that way. And then of course to the right, I have a picture of a later example of a stencil. Those are actually, the top one on the right is hand painted, but the bottom one is a gold stencil made out of paper. And that's a later process where they're making hundreds of thousands of paintings a year for one small shop. And here are some dials, of course. You can see how dials changed over time. So the early tall case dials, or grandfather clock dials as we call them today, were typically these big arch top. They're 12-inch square. They're very large, and they usually have sometimes raised gesso. They have gold leaf gilding on them. Typically little paintings of birds or houses. They're usually made up scenes. But when you get to the shelf clock, which is the second picture there, you can see they're almost the same. They're actually kind of shrinking down a little bit. And by the common shelf clock time period, by the 1830s, they get really simple. This one here only has gilding on it, but it gets the job done. It's still pretty attractive. And by the late 1830s, early 1840s, they have those printed dials, which are awfully plain. And that's when you kind of get to the more utilitarian clocks that we see today. So one thing to notice, I love now while I'm on the topic of dials, notice how the Roman numeral on clock dials is always 4 lines. And Noah Webster writes that in the Blueback Speller. That's a rule you have to follow. So if it's an IV, it gets confusing with the figure 6 on the bottom. So, so it's always 4 lines. So Chauncey Jerome, you know, he learned from Eli Terry. Chauncey Jerome's another person who I really idolize. I portrayed him a couple times at some historical things I did in the past. But Chauncey Jerome in 1824 designed an even simpler shelf clock called the bronze looking glass clock. And there's a picture of one on the right there. We call it a bronze looking glass clock because they're bronzed. Now, bronzing is a term used in the 1820s and especially the 1830s of stenciling. So you really should be picturing like that Hitchcock chair design. That's what you see when you use the word bronzing. And you can see it incorporated on the pillars and on the splat, which is the fancy piece of wood on the top of the clock. Now, these clocks included a looking glass or a mirror. Looking glass is a historical term for a mounted mirror. A mirror, I think, is something you hold, I believe, but someone may correct me on that later. Now, anyway, Jerome wrote an autobiography later in life because he got involved in some drama, but he wanted to create a history of the clock industry. So he wrote a nice early history of how clocks were made historically, and he put some numbers in. And to put it into perspective, Jerome produced no more than 10,000 of these clocks a year from 1824 to 1838. That is so many timepieces to be producing. He's making not only the mechanisms, which are all wooden gears, and these are clocks that keep time and they also ring a bell on the hour. He's also making the cases. He's commissioning people to paint the dials and to paint the tablets on them. All of it is done at the same shop, and he's making 10,000 of them a year. Now in Bristol, Connecticut, which is where he was working, there were about 15 shops operating consistently through the 20s, and by the 30s, you could double that number. So you have hundreds of thousands of clocks being produced in one small community in New England in Western Connecticut every year. So I think he was the most influential clockmaker after Eli Terry. In 1838, he took it to a whole other level. He basically designed a stamped brass clock mechanism called the OG clock. His brother Noble actually designed it, but he usually gets the credit for it. And he was making about 100,000 of those clocks a year. And he permanently ended the wooden movement clock industry. No one after Jerome started profiting off of his stamped brass gear mechanism clocks, no one was making wooden gear clocks because they couldn't afford to do it. And I have some quotes that I'll read you guys in a bit that are from the time that talk about other shops and how they're being affected by it. So after 1840, I can't really get too much into it because that's my deadline, but I have to give it to Jerome. Chauncey Jerome would become one of the richest individuals in Connecticut. He was the mayor of New Haven. He ran for the president of the United States in 1852. He was the first person to successfully export clocks to Europe, Asia, Africa, and South America. And he has an account in his autobiography of people in Southeast Asia actually turning his clock cases into little figurine cases and things. He wrote all this cool stuff about it. He was actually bankrupted by P.T. Barnum, of all people, in 1855, and he died penniless in 1868. And that is P.T. Barnum, Phineas Taylor Barnum from Bridgeport, who ran the first major circus. So that is the very same guy. They sued each other for years and all sorts of drama happened out of it. But ultimately, I'm on team Chauncey Jerome. I think it was P.T. Barnum's fault, but we won't get too much into it because that's post-period. So this is a lovely quote that I found in his autobiography that basically explains the abundance of timepieces. We kind of look at clocks in the early 19th century and think of them as a luxury item. And I always think that's not true. A lot of people had timepieces. They became so relevant and so common that everyone had them. And this quote really nails it. No family is so poor, but that they can have a timepiece which is both useful and ornamental. They can be found in every civilized portion of the globe. So I love that quote. And here's a really cool thing. I'll talk about the photo on the right, but I like to talk about where these clocks are going. So we know they're shipping them all over the world. That's post 1830s. But during the 1820s and 30s, the main target is down south. So by the early 1820s, more industries picked up. I kind of got into that and the hundreds of thousands of clocks being produced. But most of New England was saturated with shelf clocks by 1830. So most households had a timepiece during the 1830s. Now the market shifted very dramatically down south. And when you read the original account books of these clockmakers that survived, it's very fast, it's very rapid. You'll look at 1 month in 1832 and they're working out of Vermont or New Hampshire. And the following month in 1832, they're going to be working in Georgia. So the market shifted so dramatically fast because they just couldn't sell them up here anymore. They became so common. There's a great quote from Eli Burnap, Daniel Burnap's nephew in Ohio in 1824. And he writes that people are sick of wooden clocks. They're everywhere. So he wanted to go back into making those old-fashioned brass clocks, and he was bankrupted from it. He didn't make any money in it. So many clocks were exported into southern states that southern states actually started to tax the imported finished clocks. So there's this really cool scheme that happened where clockmakers would basically send an agent, maybe their son, maybe their president of their company, maybe a vice president. They would send them down south, and they would rent a small office or a small shed or a building like that, and they would have all of the clocks shipped down, not assembled yet. So it might be a whole case, but the movement hasn't been screwed in. Or it might be all the pieces of wood, but they haven't been glued or nailed together yet. And they would make up a name, and usually the names are completely made up. They're not real people, and they would sell them under that name so that they're technically made in southern states. So they're a product of southern states. They don't have to be taxed as imported pieces from the north. So here's a clock that I owned a few years ago, made by Dyer, Wadsworth and Company. And I did a lot of research trying to find out who Dyer and who Wadsworth were, and they're not real people. They never existed. This clock was actually made in 1838 by Bird, Mallory and Company in Bristol, Connecticut. And they sent 2 agents, 2 workers to go down there and assemble the clocks and sell them at a store down there to peddlers. So that's a perfect example of a false name. It's totally made up. And I love that. It's very common. I was working with our tinner, Rich Eckert, and he was doing some research on a couple of tin tool makers in Southington, Connecticut. And a lot of them were guilty of this. One of them was actually brought up to a court in Tennessee. So people did get in trouble, but this was an easy way around it. It was a loophole. So they were shipped through peddlers, canals, and boats. This is how they got around. The most predominant and most efficient way of selling clocks was peddling them. Now, typically you see clockmakers showing up at your house. This is a great old story, and saying, oh, we have all these clocks for sale. Would you like to buy one? And the average farmer is going to say, no, we don't need to put our money into that. We could put our money into our fields, into our farm and other things. And the peddler would say, oh, well, geez, I don't have any room in my cart. I'm going for a new shipment. Can I leave it at your house for a couple weeks and I'll pick it up? And the price on it's $15, by the way, but I'll be back in a couple weeks. And they said, all right, I'll hold it because it's free. You know, we don't have to pay for it for a few weeks. And the peddler would come back a few weeks later and say, oh, I know I told you it was 15, but I got quite a deal and I'll only charge you 10 for it, or I'll only charge you 14 for it. And now you'll have a deal on it. And by that point, their neighbors came over and visited, and they saw that they had it, and you don't want to get rid of it. And now you're kind of used to it. You might like the ticking and you might like the bell ringing and things like that. So that's a fun little story that goes along with the peddlers. The photo in the bottom right is of an exhibit at the American Clock and Watch Museum of their peddler exhibit. So I always love to share that picture of the wagon. You could see how the clocks were shipped there. In 1829, the Farmington Canal opened from New Haven to Farmington, Connecticut. Farmington was the neighboring town of Bristol, and in the southern part of Farmington, which is now called Plainville, there was a basin called the Bristol Basin, and that's actually where most of the clocks through the 1830s were packaged and shipped. They would ship them down to New Haven so that they could be shipped by boat to southern states a little easier. And they extended the canal up to Northampton, Massachusetts in 1835. And in 1835, you actually see an influx of clocks, common clocks in household inventories in the late 1830s, especially because of that, as a result of that. So canals were a very popular way of moving them. I have a photo of the Lock 12 Park in Cheshire, Connecticut. It's a lovely little place that is a restored canal lock. It's a really fun place to visit. It's free. There's a beautiful trail there. So they tried to export clocks internationally in the 1820s, but the long journey overseas with the wooden gears in the clocks never really worked. You typically see the clocks warping and having issues and breaking. So you see a lot of people in England especially getting really upset, and there's a lot of stuff published there in newspapers about the scam of buying a Yankee wooden clock. But Jerome started selling his brass clocks, and in 1842 he met success. So that was very important. So let's see. Alrighty. Oops. So here's some popular designs from the 1820s. The first clock there is a tall case clock. That's an Eli Terry clock made at the Porter Contract Factory. That's in our museum collection here at the Village. It's one of the first clocks you'll see in our clock gallery. Those were falling out of favor. Those were actually kind of out of style. You can see that the case is grain painted. It's not real mahogany, and that's typical. Those are very typical clocks in the 1810s and in the 1820s, but they're not very popular after Jerome and other makers are starting to change the industry. So Joseph Ives designed the second picture there, the looking glass clock, and those clocks there are about 5 feet high, a little over 4 feet high, almost 5 feet. And they're really classic empire designs. They're massive brass gear mechanisms. He made a few thousand of those, and he made some pretty bad investments with some pretty interesting individuals, and those fell out of fashion. They were an experiment to try and make affordable brass mantle clocks or shelf clocks, but those things are huge. They couldn't even fit on a mantle. You have to screw them to the wall. There's, of course, the Eli Terry pillar and scroll clock there. That's another one in our museum collection here. That is the founding father of the common clock. That's the first mass-produced design that the average person could afford. We have an original Terry and Seth Thomas clock in the Fitch House on display, very similar to the one in the photo there. And of course, you have Jerome's looking glass clock on the right. Now that clock there is special, and we'll get to that one later, but the looking glass clock is the most popular of the 1820s. These kind of go in order of popularity through the decade. And 1830s, you start to see more of an empire influence in the cabinetry. You start to see cabinet makers from all over New England, mostly Eastern Connecticut, learning in those old apprenticeship cabinetry shops. And they're moving to urban areas like Bristol, like Worcester. There's actually Holden, Massachusetts had one individual in particular who I'll get to. But anyway, you start to see these big fancy additions to the earlier designs. So if you check out the first clock there, it's the same as Chauncey Jerome's bronze looking glass clock, but instead of the bronzing and the stenciling, it's carved, which is very typical. You have a new Ives design. This is a brass mechanism clock. They made thousands of these in the 1830s, but they're big. They're about 3 feet high. They probably weigh about 20 or 25 pounds. They're awfully heavy because they have these big weights in them, but they last 8 days, which means you only have to wind it once a week. With most wooden clocks, you typically have to wind them every day. So those were quite the luxury, but that's still something that could be afforded by a lower middle class. In 1834, E.C. Brewster in Bristol, Connecticut, designs the first spring clock, and that's the first clock that has a spring in it, so it doesn't have to have those weights that you wind up every day. And those are in that Gothic revival beehive clock, as we call them, or those steeple clocks. And then Chauncey Jerome's 1838 or 1839 OG clock. Those clocks were made of brass. They made about 100,000 of them a year. They sold for $1 a piece when wooden clocks were still selling for $4 or $5 a piece by that time. And they were made as late as 1910. They made them forever. So that's a beautiful example. That's an early original one made by Chauncey Jerome in Bristol before he moved to New Haven and started his ventures there and got in trouble later on. So how much did a clock cost? This is a question I always get talking about the Bixby clock in the Village. These are listings from an account book of Ephraim Downs. He was a clockmaker in Bristol, Connecticut from the 1810s to the early 1830s, late 1830s. So his accounts here start in about 1830. These are the listings that I took from it. An average bronze looking glass clock would cost between $9 and $8.50. And you'll see that through the decade, by the late 1830s, the prices dropped dramatically. And by 1838, a clock would cost about $4. So they're less than half of their worth. And these quotes here from Eli Terry Jr.'s clock shop, that's Eli Terry's son, of course, these quotes really, really best reflect that situation that's going on. So these are letters that survived. And you have a listing from 1836 that a common bronze 30 hour is $4.50. Now what he's referring to is a bronze looking glass clock. In 1837, he writes, "We will send you 30-hour bronze," those are the bronze looking glass clocks, "for $4. By these long credits, we cannot stand." And then in 1839, a few years later, "Our arrangements have been such as of late that we have very few of that kind to sell. The fact is they afford so little profit that almost all manufacturers have turned their attention to other business, and we have in measure followed suit." And that's one of my favorite quotes in clock shop from the whole 1830s. Now, what he's talking about here is the innovation of the brass clock, Jerome's 30-hour OG clock, those ones that he's making 100,000 of a year. And you could see in March of 1839, Jerome went into production probably about 2 months earlier than that. So in 2 months, you actually see such an impact that wooden clock makers can't even keep up anymore, and you don't have any makers making wooden clocks really after this time. Now I have a photo of a banknote in the top right of the Bristol Manufacturers Exchange Company. That's a $3 banknote from Bristol. That's an early one from 1814, and it's signed by Lot Newell, who was an early investor in the clock industry. Lot Newell bankrupted a lot of people. He went to debtor's prison, and he's quite a character. A good friend of mine, Mary Jane Dapkus, just wrote a book about him. And the looking glass clock, which I pictured earlier. But a great person whose name is on there is George Mitchell. George Mitchell was an early clockmaker who ran a line of credit at a store that he owned. So he was a storekeeper in Bristol, and he was a quote unquote clockmaker, but he was really more of a community investor. He would work basically dropping off those glass paintings or dropping off blank dials that haven't been painted yet at young lady or young gentlemen's houses where they could do outwork. And through George Mitchell, he would be the one going and moving those materials to clock shops, basically. And as payment, he would actually keep a credit in his store. So for example, if a young lady painted $10 worth of glass paintings, instead of being paid in cash, given being a cash poor society, she could get a couple dollars of credit in the store, or the same value in credit in the store. And George Mitchell doesn't have to move that money around, so his signature is on here. So clockmaking in Connecticut today, this is where we'll wrap up this section because we've already hit 1840. The Connecticut School of Clockmaking, which is the line of clockmakers starting with Thomas Harlan, actually still continues to the present day, although no mechanisms have been industrially produced in Connecticut for several decades. So this shows the lineage of knowledge passed down through individuals and industries. It started with Thomas Harlan. He trained Daniel Burnap, who trained Eli Terry, who trained Chauncey Jerome. After Chauncey Jerome was bankrupted, he joined a joint stock company, which turned into the Waterbury Clock Company. The Waterbury Clock Company sold out in 1943 to United States Time Corp, which turned into Timex in 1969. And Timex is still in business today, of course. So, and they're still, I believe their headquarters is in Connecticut. So you still have a lineage of the Connecticut school that exists today. And I'm a clockmaker myself, so I consider myself part of this lineage of clockmakers, although I didn't learn from any of these individuals directly. They've all been dead for hundreds of years, but I learned from their work and what they left behind. So I'll wrap up my talk on Connecticut clockmaking there, and I want to talk a little bit about the Bixby clock. And for those who've been following social media or who've been following the staff here at the village, this clock has been a really big deal for myself, and the staff have been really excited about it because it's a working timepiece that we have in one of our houses. Now, the Bixby family is my favorite family from Old Sturbridge Village. We know more about them than any other family who lived in a house that we have here, and we've done an extraordinary amount of research on the family and the house. And we also tie in the Outwork, which I think is so important because it also does tie in with the clockmaking community as well, with those dials and those paintings. Now, on the first picture here on the left, that's the original Bixby clock. The story of this clock is that it was just found in the house. When we got the house in the 1980s, the house had a couple of things, really a lot of stuff that was original to the family. This clock was one of those artifacts that was found in the house, and for years it hung on the wall in the house. But when we started doing more programming in there a few years ago, we took the clock out. Now, the Bixbys actually supposedly had two clocks. We have another tall case clock in our museum collection. It's not on view, but they did have another clock that came out of the house. Now, the Bixbys were Emerson, Laura, and three daughters. Emerson was a blacksmith. They lived in Barre, Massachusetts. That's probably 20, 30 miles north of Sturbridge. Really west, center of Massachusetts, basically, middle of nowhere today. Sorry for anyone who's from that area, but it's a very rural area. And the Bixbys did work from home. They did Outwork. They focused on braiding straw, focusing and working with the massive straw hat industry that was going on in Barre at the time. They did shoe uppers. There was a massive shoe industry in Connecticut. So you typically had the young ladies sewing shoe uppers and braiding straw. And you could learn more about that in the house. But the Bixbys had this clock here, which ironically, and this is my favorite thing about it, it's so ironic, it was made in 1838. It was made by Charles Stratton in Holden, Massachusetts, the neighboring community from Barre. And I'll tell you a little bit more about the maker, but the second photo is the reproduction in the house today. I wound it up this morning, so it should have been running today, but you got to wind it every day. So I go down first thing in the morning and I wind the weights up. If you look at the photo all the way to the right, you can see those two weights at the top and the pendulum, of course. So this clock is a reproduction of the original to scale and almost exact. There are a few differences. A big difference, if you notice on the label, is of course it has my name on it because I'm the one who made it. But I also put Charles Stratton's name on it, of course. Now, when I made this clock, I built the case here at the village, and I built the mechanism in my Plymouth, Connecticut workshop where I reproduce historical clocks. So here's a picture of the Bixby house. It's next to our blacksmith shop in the countryside. There's the Bixby shelf clock and the Bixby tall clock, which was made by Waterbury clock manufacturer in around 1809, about the same time the house was built. The clock is extraordinarily crooked, so it must have been in a spot in the house where the floorboards were shifted because they cut the bottom of the case so that it would stand straight. So kind of a funny thing. So on our cabinet making weekend, back in 2021, when we first opened up our cabinet shop, I wanted to do a focus on clock making because a lot of the clock makers during the 1830s were actually cabinet makers. You see makers in Bristol who start to stop making cases. They're only making mechanisms and selling them. And a big maker was Chauncey Boardman. He was making wooden gear mechanisms. There's a photo on the left there of a Chauncey Boardman mechanism. That's the dark set of wooden gears that are there on the table. And you also have people like Elbridge Atkins, who actually made the mechanism for the Bixby clock in particular. And they're selling the mechanisms to cabinet makers who build the cases. So Charles Stratton was not a true clockmaker. He was a cabinet maker. And he built the case for the clock that's now in the Bixby house, or the original that was in the Bixby house, but he did not make the mechanism. He was only a cabinet maker. So I set up a shop in the visitor center showing what a cabinet maker's shop would have looked like, where they would be doing the hammer veneering and all of the practices on how clocks were made. I made the entire Bixby clock case using historical tools, practices, technology. The veneer was glued on with hide glue, so I had a hide glue pot going the whole time. It was really a wonderful experience. I had blueprints showing how the case is designed. And I had the mechanism in progress. In the center of the photo on the left, you could see the mechanism without the gears made yet. Those are just the plates. So here are some pictures of progress during that cabinet making weekend. I made this clock in 3 days. And I put so much effort into it. I wanted to make sure it was exact. And my favorite thing about this clock is actually my least favorite thing about this clock. Charles Stratton was competing against an industry that was producing hundreds of thousands of clocks a year. And he was in a rural area, so he wanted to profit from his vicinity, basically. He wanted to sell clocks to his neighbors. And I believe personally that the Bixbys were the original owners of this clock. But anyway, Charles Stratton was in such a hurry that he didn't do a very good job, and I don't want to pass judgment on him, but the top of all of his clocks are crooked. It's called a splat. So if you look at the photo on the right, There's a fancy little carved piece of wood at the top of the clock, and it's crooked. One side is higher than the other. And that's totally unacceptable for my quality of woodworking, but I met with our curator team and I asked them, I said, guys, I really don't want to make this clock crooked. I want to make it nice and balanced because it'll kill me. And we all agreed, yeah, it's probably best we should reproduce it exactly as it is. And it's one of those fun little things. I love it, but I hate it. So now here's the mechanism. Here's a photo of the original mechanism on the left and a photo of my reproduction mechanism on the right. So I did not make this mechanism here in the village. I made this mechanism at home in my Plymouth workshop, but occasionally I'd bring it out in the village and show people some progress on it. And the reason why is the way I machined gears at that time. I was basically building replicas of what I believed historical machines looked like, and they were water powered. Now I don't have a water powered mill in my backyard, so I have to use modern machinery. So I used a drill press, and I'll show you guys what my machine looked like in the next couple slides. But it was not something that I could have done in person because this was done in a factory setting historically. But the gears in this clock are really cool, and they follow Eli Terry's standard. This is a standard that he likely learned from the Cheneys early on in his apprentice days. But the gears are made out of cherry wood. The plates that hold the gears together are made out of oak, usually quarter-sawn red or white oak. And the pinions, the small gears, are made out of mountain laurel, which who would have thought, you know, they picked such a small little shrub like that. But mountain laurel is such a dense material. It takes a very long time to grow. If you have it growing in your yard, it probably hasn't grown much in the last few decades. It's so dense, it grows slowly, that it makes a perfect extra hard gears that don't break under pressure. Now, every wooden clock has one brass gear, and you can see the brass gear in the middle of each of these clocks here. And that's what makes the tick-tock sound. That gear pushes a pendulum back and forth. It's called an escape wheel. That's where the energy escapes the movement and pushes the energy down into the pendulum. The pendulum goes back and forth and makes the tick-tock sound. So they all have one brass gear, but those are the materials that are used. Some early Massachusetts clockmakers who were making wooden clocks used maple. The Ashby clockmakers all used maple and oak and ash, and they hold up, but those are porous materials. Cherry and mountain laurel work really well together, and that's something that the Cheneys spent years in the early 1700s developing, and they really mastered it. So every clock that was made in Connecticut after Eli Terry was made out of oak, mountain laurel, and cherry. So, and you can see this movement had to be accurate. It had to be very, very accurate for it to work properly. So, so you can see in the photo, I do take pride in how it came out, and it's been working so far for a few years. So knock on wood, but so here's my gear cutting machine. This is a copy that I built a few years ago of Daniel Burnap's gear cutting machine. Now, Daniel Burnap's clock shop actually survived. It was actually all stored in the attic of his house in Andover, Connecticut, which was Coventry back then. And they're all now at the Connecticut Historical Society. So I went to their museum in Hartford and I took some measurements of the original machine, which is on display there. And I replicated this one here. This machine would have been outdated by the 1830s. There's actually a letter from Daniel Burnap's nephew requesting to buy this machine, and Daniel Burnap wouldn't sell it because he knew it wouldn't make him any money, so he wouldn't even consider selling it to him, even though he had long since retired from the industry. He just held on to it. But this is a machine that Eli Terry would have learned clockmaking on. There is a disc on the bottom. It looks like a record player, and that counts how many, or an old music box, it counts how many teeth are on each gear. It's hand powered, so you crank it by hand and it turns a small circular saw that cuts the brass gears. When I reproduce wooden clocks today, I use this machine to cut wooden gears. It works on wooden gears too, but it's especially good for brass gears. So this is actually a photo of the brass gear on the Bixby clock when I was cutting it with my period cutting machine. I did that entirely by hand. And you could see the gear in the photo on the right getting cut out. The teeth have to be filed to that shape by hand afterwards, but they would have mass produced those historically, and they would have done those in those water powered shops. So. Now, a few years ago, this is really something that got me interested in this because I started clockmaking when I was 11 years old, and I really had a lot of good resources to take advantage of. I had the Clock Museum in Bristol, Connecticut down the road, and I had the Historical Society in Plymouth, where we had a lot of early documents and information about clockmaking. But this machine was up in the attic. This is actually an original wood lathe, and we didn't know anything about it. I found it up there when I was overseeing their collection at the museum there at the Plymouth Historical Society. And I saw it and I numbered it, I tagged it, and I archived it in our database, and I put the machine back. And I went home and I thought about it, and I didn't sleep. I think I ended up driving back there that night because I had to see it again and take a look at it because it just screamed clockmaker's lathe. And I spent so much time looking at this and evaluating it. I got some other experts in the community involved, and we ended up finding documentation on this. This is an original machine that came out of the Porter Contract Factory building. It probably was later, maybe from Silas Hoadley's time period, but this is an original lathe that's water powered that was used to turn out wooden gears and wooden pinions. And it actually has a section on it where templates and jigs would rest, so they would be able to mass produce interchangeable parts on it. And this was a really big deal. This is the first piece of industrial machinery from a clock shop that has ever surfaced. There's a machine behind it in the photo that was found in the 1950s from the Hopkins and Alfred clock shop in Harwington, Connecticut. But the lathe is the only one that's complete. Everything is there. It just doesn't have the templates and jigs, which would be obviously stored elsewhere in the factory. So I like to show this because this is where my influence came from when I talk about how I just casually put together a clockmaking machine one weekend or something like that. This was a really big deal. It's traveled with me to all sorts of different regional clock collecting picnics and things like that. And it's one of my favorite things to get to see and examine. Every time I see it, I get very excited because it is the original. So this is how I cut gears. I have some photos to show you guys really quick, and then we'll go into questions and answers. So this is a machine I built back in December to basically mass produce a few dozen gears at a time. So the gears are made out of cherry. They're mounted on this machine here. You can see what's called an indexing plate. This is basically a historically crude Bridgeport milling machine. The plate on the back that's made of brass has all those holes punched in it, and they're equidistant from each other. They count how many teeth are on one gear. And there's a cutting saw in my drill press, and this machine basically slides back and forth. It's very similar to how they were mass producing wooden gears during the 1810s, 20s, and 30s. And this is a machine that I use occasionally when I'm making some later production copies for people. But you can see the cutting bit only cuts one side of the tooth. And in this photo, it's going to change. You'll see it has started to cut the tail edge of the tooth. So if a gear, for example, has 30 teeth, you need to cut the tail edge and the leading edge of the teeth, both sides. So you have to pass it through the saw 60 times. So 30 times 2 is 60. And you could see how some of those teeth are cut out, but the first pass is already gone, and the second pass is going through, cutting out perfect precision teeth. And this here, you could see the gears finished. So this is exactly how I made the gears in the Bixby clock, and they're they work pretty well. It's been working for a little over a year and a half now, and I go down and I wind it every day. And I think I'll finish up there so you can see kind of how I machined some of these gears, why I couldn't do it at the village to show people, but it's still a fun thing I got to share here tonight. So, all right, well, thank you all for joining us, but let's go into questions and answers. So we have a couple questions here. So let's see, Tom Morehouse. Was there no face on the box clock, just transparent glass? So I could show you. Let's see, the box clock was Eli Terry's attempt of making a very affordable clock. Now, if you take a look here, he really, really limited himself on what materials he used. He made the wooden mechanism, but if you take a look, the face is actually painted on the glass. It's kind of hard to see, but that was his way of economically saving time and saving materials. So by 1816 and 1817, when he starts making pillar and scroll clocks, he realizes he didn't have to try too hard. He could make just as much money making all the other parts. So, all right. Karen said, when did chiming in clocks begin? Chiming has always been there. you see, actually chiming came first. The earliest clock that still works today was made in the 1300s. I believe it's in England, and it's in a cathedral. It rings a bell on the hour, but it has no face. It does not tell the time. It rings the time. It chimes it on the bell. It still works. There's some really fantastic videos of it working online that you could find. And later on, they start putting an hour hand on steeples or on towers on these cathedrals. And by the 1700s, you start to see minute hands. And so the chiming has always been there, but occasionally you have some early crude clockmakers making those early wooden mechanisms that only made timepieces. So how is OG spelled? It is spelled so many different ways. Now I used to go to this auction house that has since closed, and the auctioneer, Richard Watt, would always say, you call it an OG clock because it falls off the wall and you go OG, and I always love that. Anyway, they spell it OG as in the letter O and the letter G, and they spell it OGEE. So, so there's different ways to spell it. I've seen a bunch of different variations, but in historical record, I see all of those variations. So it's always spelled differently. So are there any surviving wooden gear mechanisms that still work? I'm thinking they're more susceptible to damage from heat, cold, humidity, etc. Was a specific type of wood used for the gears? Now, this is probably before I went into it, but I'll tell you, wooden gear clocks are extremely durable. I don't think that the original clockmakers had any idea that their clocks would last more than 20 or 30 years. So it's really remarkable. I wonder what they think today, having been over 200 years, and some of these clocks do still work today. I have a lot of clocks in my collection that are wooden gears that I run personally, but I know how to maintain them, and I am very well versed in how to take care of them properly. In a museum setting, we typically don't run wooden clocks because we want them to last into perpetuity and maintain them to the best of our standards. So, so I run some of my wooden clocks, some of them I don't because they're more rare and it's not really worth the risk of damaging them. And there are friends of mine that don't run wooden clocks at all that collect them. They just want them to stay safe and secure. I'll tell you, the only damage I've ever seen on a wooden clock was the result of someone mishandling it. I've never seen wooden clocks that wore down from wear over time. I've seen pinions that wear down because someone replaced a broken tooth with the wrong material. It's very common that people think they use oak, which is such a hard wood. That's a durable wood. And that's a well thought out idea. But you see people fix wooden gears all the time with oak, and it's so hard and abrasive, it actually wears away the mountain laurel pinions. So they would have used cherry originally. So when I do repairs, I focus on that. But yeah, they do last. There are many of them that still work. Eli Terry built a tower clock for the Plymouth, Connecticut church, Plymouth, Connecticut Congregational Church. This is a huge mechanism. The biggest gears are probably about 1.5 feet in diameter, made of cherry wood. These are massive, massive pieces of wood, and it's still running today as we speak up in the steeple. The only thing you typically see with humidity or with cold and heat is the clock runs slower in the summer and faster in the winter. And that's not a result of the gears, that's a result of the pendulum. The brass on the pendulum expands in heat and contracts during colder environments. So think of a pendulum as a metronome. Now, at the bottom of every pendulum, there's a screw that you can control to move the pendulum up and down, just like an upside down metronome, to regulate the clock. And there's directions in all of these clocks that tell you how to do that. So more information than you ever wanted to know. Do you have any videos of yourself cutting gears? I don't, but I'm actually producing a couple of wooden clocks right now, and I will probably get some videos. I might be able to send some to our marketing staff here, to our social media leads, and maybe we could get something together, but that'll be in the future. So, all right, Tom, we have a friend of Tom Morehouse, who's an extraordinary individual. We both worked in Mansfield. Benjamin Hanks is much remembered. Where does he fit in clock history? So I'm actually not familiar with Benjamin Hanks, unfortunately. There were a lot of makers in Eastern Connecticut. I'm from Western Connecticut, which is where I specialize in the industries there. And my focus is more, it's kind of funny, it's a weird spectrum. It's more on the earliest makers of wooden clocks and the industrial makers of wooden clocks. So I don't know much about Mr. Hanks. I only know a small handful of individuals that worked out of Eastern Connecticut. There are, of course, Daniel Burnap, there's the Avery family of clockmakers. Most people in Eastern Connecticut were making those higher quality, expensive brass clocks. There were very few people in Eastern Connecticut producing wooden common clocks. So unfortunately, I'm not familiar, I apologize. So would people use clocks on the wall before they added or bought a box? So with the box clock, it came with the box and they'd actually ship it on the wagon all together. And that's what made it so special, because you didn't have to buy a case. The mechanism for these shelf clocks came with the case when you buy them from a peddler. But early on, when you bought a tall case mechanism, those early mass-produced ones from like the Porter contract, you'd have to build a case for those. You'd have to go to a cabinet maker and you'd have to have them build the case for you. And that was very expensive. So, but typically you saw people hanging those movements up on the wall and they call them wag on the wall clocks because the pendulum would wag back and forth. So is there a difference between chiming and striking? No, chiming and striking is the same thing. They're just two terms that you use to determine a type of clock. So in account books, you see historically the word chime, strike, or sounding clock. You'll see that a lot. And those are all just terms that they use to list a example of a timepiece that also rings a bell. So how long did weight-driven clocks endure? They lasted as long as they were taken care of. There's a clock that I have at home. The people who owned it before me kept it running for many decades. And I still keep it running in my kitchen today. It's a grandfather clock. It was made in 1806, and it still runs today. It has relatively no wear inside. It's really remarkable. So again, they last as long as they're well taken care of and as long as they're not mishandled by the person who's taking care of it. So you typically see people with key wound clocks winding them backwards, and they use too much force and they destroy every tooth on all the wooden gears in there because they're going the wrong direction. You see people who wind it up so tight that the pressure from the string causes all the teeth to break. Or you see people who wind them up violently and that creates damage. And then of course you have the neighborhood handyman who gets his hand on it and covers it in motor oil and destroys it. So there's all sorts of ways to ruin a clock. I've seen probably a million different ways and I don't think I've seen half. So, so they'll last a pretty good long time. So what was used to calibrate the correct time to set a newly made, newly delivered clock? That's a fantastic question because you have to think of it. If you didn't have a clock and your neighbor does not have a clock, how do you know what time it is? And your clock just arrived in your house. Maybe you were away for a weekend and you couldn't wind it that day and it stopped. How did you set the time? Now, early clockmakers like Eli Terry Jr. And another one is Norris North from Torrington, Connecticut. They actually put charts in the inside of the clock that were printed that can help you calculate the height of the sun and determine the time that way. It's nothing any different than you'd see in a farmer's almanac from the day. So there was a way to calculate it, but I don't think the average farmer was doing that. We forget there's another factor here. Pocket watches. Most individuals probably had pocket watches, and if you didn't have one, your neighbor might have. Now, how do you regulate a pocket watch? When you go into town, the church may have a clock on it. If it doesn't have a clock on the steeple, it probably has one inside. And you're regulating time that way. By the 1800s, there's a pretty standardized system of time going on. You see it in letters a lot when people write letters to each other. They are pretty adamant that we meet at exactly 8 o'clock or 8:30 or at the specific time at the specific location. So the average people were very well aware of their time, but regulating time is something you do by seeing other people's clocks. I have a phenomenal story that's very recent. This took place in the 1940s in Bristol, Connecticut, and I actually got to meet the individual. Many old timers, and excuse me for using that phrase, but many old timers remember back in the day in industrial communities, at 12 o'clock, they'd ring a bell if you had a big industry in your town, or they'd blow a steam whistle. A lot of people remember that time. And I met an individual who he pulled the original steam whistle at 12 noon every day in Bristol, Connecticut. And every morning he'd walk past Michael's Jewelers and set his watch to the time on the clock in the storefront window. And he'd go up at 12 o'clock and pull the steam whistle. One day he went into Michael's Jewelers and he asked them, how on earth do you regulate your clock because it is so remarkably accurate? And the guy said, well, it's easy. I regulate it to the steam whistle at Ingram's. So Bristol could have been making up their own time for decades. I actually got to meet the individual who did that. So that was a really phenomenal experience. So yeah, regulating time is something that's really standardized in the Victorian era, but by the 1830s, we've got it relatively under control. Railroads really changed timing because with a railroad, if you're a minute off, you could have a deadly accident. Was there a way to fix a broken wooden gear, or was the point to change out interchangeable parts? That's a very good question. So historically, if you look at the labels on these clocks, they always have a warranty. So if a gear broke, you'd probably go back to the factory or ask someone or write a letter to the factory and they'd send you a new part. The Seth Thomas Clock Company, there's probably not one person in this webinar that doesn't have a Seth Thomas clock in their presence or in their home. They made them all the way up until a few years ago. The Seth Thomas Company kept a stock on hand of original wooden gears in their maintenance department all the way up to the 1970s when they closed. So we actually found, they did an evaluation, a gentleman, Ward Francillin and Ken Roberts and Snowden Taylor and a couple of other individuals during that time, did an evaluation of the parts, and they found replacement parts from their maintenance shop that went all the way back to the box clock, which was extraordinary. These were unused parts. So all the way up to the 1970s, you could actually write a letter to that factory, which was still in business, and they could send you a spare part. But you typically see them being clocks being victims of the neighborhood handyman. It'd be easier to fix it yourself than wait for a new part to be shipped down. So did Benjamin Cheney just fade out of the picture because people like Eli Terry were better at business? Absolutely. Benjamin Cheney was an individual, I mean, I think he died by the time actually Eli Terry set up business, but people like Benjamin Cheney, Elijah Cheney, his son, who learned with Eli Terry, with Benjamin, making early wooden clocks. Elijah fell victim of a lot of experimentation in industry. He was brought up in the old way, and he couldn't really compete with the new way. So you see him in the 1830s in Middletown, Connecticut, trying to produce shelf clocks, and he doesn't do a very good job. He isn't very good at the industry. Eli Terry just totally destroyed any early industry that was going, any early shop work that was going on. Daniel Burnap retired. He couldn't make clocks anymore. When his nephew, I mentioned this earlier, his nephew moved to Ohio and wanted to make clocks there. And Daniel Burnap was writing him letters of discouragement saying, don't go into this field. Don't even do it. It's different. Unfortunately, we don't have any sources that talk about from Daniel Burnap about Eli Terry, but sometimes I often wonder, what did he think? He trained this kid and this kid just totally destroyed the whole system that's been going on, but he created an industry. So, alrighty, no question, but with all your knowledge and instrumental abilities, Sturbridge and OSV Vans are lucky to have you. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. So I think you came in a couple weeks ago and I was playing the melodeon and did some stuff with woodwinds. So your name's familiar. Thank you. What are those, let's see, what about those beautiful silver or brass dials? Alrighty, most of those clocks are, let's see, I should be able to get to it up here. See, it's just lagging here. These are engraved brass dials, and these dials here are really gorgeous. What you actually find is almost all of these are engraved by Daniel Burnap. Thomas Harland was an engraver and Daniel Burnap was an engraver, but you almost always find receipts that survived in Daniel Burnap's account books. We know that Daniel Burnap supplied a couple of dials to Eli Terry, and we know that he supplied a couple of dials to Thomas Harland. So remember, Thomas Harland was making more of those, working more with watches. He didn't have time to engrave all those dials and everything. So Daniel Burnap did it because he was a real expert silver and goldsmith. Those dials were very, very popular. They're actually made out of brass, and there is a process that they do to silver them. It's a chemical process. Daniel Burnap has an original receipt that survived in one of his accounts that talks about how he did it, but I won't get into it. These dials were really only made to make wooden clocks look like brass clocks. And if you actually look at early wooden clocks made by Eli Terry, the early grandfather clocks from the Porter contract, Silas Hoadley clocks in particular, they actually painted winding holes on the dial, on the wooden dial, to make it look like a brass gear clock. Even though wooden clocks don't usually have keys, you usually wind them up by pulling a string. So those dials were really a 1700s thing. Those fell out of fashion in the early 1800s. I don't think any of them were really produced after the 1790s. How well did the wooden gear clocks keep time? That's a good question. From my personal experience, I've never really seen a lot of variations. I've had some brass clocks keep worse time than wooden clocks. Now, a clock is as accurate as the person who maintains it can make it. So as weather changes, excuse me, you are obligated to adjust the clock to the temperature. And that's something that you'll notice. So usually everyone makes fun of me because I have all these antique clocks that I keep running. And every time I see them, I pull up my phone and make sure it's on the right time. Now I do that because I know no one else is doing that. They're looking at the clock and hoping that I'm keeping it in good time. But when I'm regulating a clock, I'm making sure that it's kept accurate. So I have a wooden gear clock in my kitchen, a grandfather clock I'd mentioned before from 1806. And that one probably loses or gains a minute every other week, which is a pretty good regulation. Brass clocks are really kind of the same. Wooden clocks, the gears are not what keeps time. The pendulum swinging is what keeps time. The gears just supply the energy to the pendulum. So it depends on the quality of the pendulum bob. Now, when you get into the Victorian era, you see pendulums made out of mercury and brass. Now, brass expands in heat and gets heavier. Mercury, think of a thermometer, it expands and it gets higher. So they counteract each other. So you see mercury pendulums. Those are very, very accurate clocks. So here you go. You mentioned well taken care of a few times. Can you define how to take care of a clock? I have a couple of early 1900s spring clocks that I'd like to keep running well. So 1900s clocks are very, very different from the early wooden clocks that I typically specialize in. But the best way to maintain a clock is to keep it clean from dust. Make sure you're winding it in the right direction. Make sure you're not winding them too tight. There's no such thing as overwinding a clock, but you don't want to wind it too tight because you run the risk of breaking the spring that's in there. And send them out to get serviced. You want to make sure if you keep a clock running that you have the people around who are able to maintain it for you. So every couple of years, send it out, make sure the dust is blown out of it, put some oil the pivots on it. Do not oil a clock yourself unless you are trained. Most people, I've seen clocks covered in motor oil, and that's not the way to do it. You do not put oil on the gears, you only put it on the pivots. Yeah, so a well taken care of clock is one that's been cleaned of dust. Dust is an abrasive material. It sticks to the oil in the pivots, and as the gears spin around, it will eat away the brass material. It could even damage the steel pivots. So I've seen steel pivots worn away almost hair thin. It's absolutely amazing, and that's from people not cleaning dust out of them. So keep for a brass clock, keep it dust free and get it oiled from your local clock repair person every few years, and it should run a couple hundred years. So wooden clocks, make sure they're dust free. They don't need any oil, but every now and then they might need new bushings, and that's a whole other story. So when were weight-driven clocks last produced? Well, I still produce weight-driven clocks today. But you start to stop seeing weight-driven clocks historically in the 1830s and 40s as spring clocks rose in popularity. I had a photograph of one of the earliest spring clocks, which was that beehive-shaped clock in the slideshow earlier. And spring clocks were originally made with brass springs, and brass is not a good material to make springs out of. It's extremely heavy, it's extremely dense, and they lose their tension and their elasticity over time. So by the 1840s, Bristol, Connecticut makers really perfected steel springs, and they started making extraordinarily accurate springs that worked really well. And the whole point of making a spring clock was you don't need to have a weight clock. A weight clock takes up space. It needs to be large because the weight has to fall a certain amount of space. The longer the weight has to drop, the longer the clock will run between winding it. So an OG clock, for example, needs about 2.5 feet to keep time for one day. that's a really bulky case. They have to be square, they can't really be made that attractive. But if you make a spring mechanism, you don't have weights at all. You can make a clock that is round and fits in a little tiny case like this. You can make a clock that hangs on the wall and has a pendulum. You can make a shelf clock that's about 4 or 5 inches tall. So with spring clocks, you stop seeing weight-driven clocks. But what happens is spring clocks are not good timekeepers. They're under extra pressure when they're fully wound, and as the week goes on, the pressure decreases, which means the force to the pendulum decreases. So what happens is they don't keep very good time, so they start making weight-driven clocks in the Victorian era again. So where does one learn clockmaking or repair? You could learn clockmaking or repair through local old timers. We call them old cranks because they crank up the clocks. It's a fun term that we use. Or the NAWCC community. That's the National Museum of Watch and Clock Collectors. If you reach out to some people in that organization, you'll definitely find individuals. There are a lot of individuals around who specialize in this field. I'm one of the big experts in the wooden clock community, but I have a lot of friends who are working in the brass community and other things. We're all in our own field in the clock community. Watches, that's a whole other breed of people. They do their own thing. So what are the hands usually made of? If you look at Thomas Harlan's clock there and Daniel Burnapp's, those are steel. When you get to Eli Terry's time, they're cast pewter. So pretty cool. Do these historic timepieces need routine maintenance to keep their gears, etc., to their gears to keep them running? They just need to be clean. So that's all. We own one of those very common Chauncey Jerome brass clocks. Keeps very good time, have a wooden work Silas Hoadley that we can't keep running. Alrighty, so it sounds like the Hoadley clock needs some maintenance, and that's where they probably need new bushings. That's something that happens. But those Chauncey Jerome clocks will last you more than your lifetime. They've got hundreds of years left in them. They really are phenomenal pieces. And it looks like we've got 2 more questions, and we're going on a little past 7, so I'll answer these 2 questions, and I think we'll wrap up there. But what changed in the availability of brass that affected the wooden gear market? Was sheet brass for stamping newly available versus the earlier limited availability for melting down scrap metal? So that's a good question. Chauncey Jerome noticed that brass industries were opening up all throughout Connecticut. There was an industry in Canaan, Connecticut that found some brass and copper ore in the ground. And in Bristol, of all places, there was a copper mine found in the late 1790s. A couple people mined it for a few years, but by the 1830s, someone bought the land that was there and they really started to do a lot of mining there. You don't really think of New England as having a lot of natural resources that can be mined, but there are large copper deposits. So by the 1830s, the copper industry coming in is really rising, and it just so happens to be in the exact same community that all of these clocks are being produced. So by the 1830s, Chauncey Jerome was able to find enough material to supply brass. Now, when you're in the colonial era, you're underneath British rule, and that's totally restricting how many materials can be moved back and forth. We had a whole revolution about it. But what happened is you basically couldn't get raw material like that. Even in England, there were people who were restricted. Watchmakers could not make the entire watch in England during that period. They could only make specific parts, and the maker was the one who put all the parts together and signed his name on it. And sometimes they're not even signed because they didn't make all the parts. So there's a lot of restrictions going on. It kind of comes out of the medieval guild system. But by the 1830s and 40s, with Chauncey Jerome's brass clock, the United States has been its own country for several decades, and we've had plenty of time to invest in our own resources and find our own materials. Now, the clock industry is directly going to affect the brass industries that open up later on, that evolve from the early copper industries. The biggest one, which probably still stands out today, is Anaconda Brass from Waterbury, Connecticut. Chauncey Jerome was also related to that. Zinc is another one we don't have until the later 1800s. Zinc was something that they were buying in bulk. I think they were importing it from somewhere. Thank you for the comment on that, because it's an important thing for brass. Even these early wooden clocks, the hammer that rings the bell is made of zinc, which is pretty cool. They're sourcing it from somewhere, but I don't know where. The dials on the clocks in the 1840s are actually made of zinc, rolled zinc. So Anaconda Brass was big. They made a lot of munitions for the World Wars, and they closed in the 20th century. So last question, how do I know a clock repair person is going to do a good repair? Unfortunately, you need to find someone who is well reputed. That's a good question to ask, because you don't want to take a clock to someone who will do damage. And I have seen countless clocks really destroyed by individuals who don't know what they're doing. Now, I acknowledge, for example, I specialize in wooden clocks. I wouldn't dare work on a spring clock for someone, even though I can maintain my own. I haven't formally been trained in that field, so I wouldn't work on those, and I could own up to that. But often you find individuals who don't, and they just do it for the money, and they will really, you often find a lot of damages happening to original pieces. So you need to find someone with a good reputation, and the best thing you could do is reach out to multiple individuals and ask if they are familiar with each other. The clock community is relatively friendly, especially here in New England in particular. I don't know about most of Western United States. And New England and East Coast side here, a lot of us know each other. It's a small community and we all get along pretty well. So if this person who you reach out to isn't fully confident working on it, they will know someone who they can recommend. So the best thing you could do is reach out to multiple individuals, and you could find people online. You can reach out to other organizations and try and contact people that way. But alrighty, so thank you guys. I think we'll wrap up there.
Awesome.
So I hope this was interesting for everyone. I always joke, it's more information than anyone ever wanted to know, but I hope it was insightful. I hope you guys enjoyed it. Please, 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 next time you guys come to the village, go ahead to the Bixby house, take a look at the clock, and if you see a music performance on the map guide, because I'm our lead in music here, track me down and I could show you guys the clock up close. I always love to share the history of it, and I'll give you a little tour. So thank you guys. Thanks for the insight.
Awesome, Tom. Thank you so much for this presentation and for sharing your knowledge with us. If you did not catch the entire program or you would like to share a recording of it, recording will be sent to our members and in the following week, and it will also be uploaded onto the Old Sturbridge Village YouTube page. Thank you again, Tom, and thank you all for joining us tonight. I hope that everyone has a great evening.
Thank you, guys.
Bye.